like to welcome everybody to today's presentation, Creating a DevSecOps Playbook, brought to you by CloudBees. Before we get started, I would like to introduce you to our presenters. Our first presenter is Derek. So Derek, if you would say hello, and
Hello.
audience, let me know if you can hear Derek by posting a message in the chat panel.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here, and this should be a great panel today.
Great, looks like everyone can hear you. Our next presenter is Shannon. So Shannon, if you would say hello, and audience, let me know if you can hear Shannon by posting a message in the chat panel.
Hi, it's Shannon Leitz.
Great. Our next presenter is DJ. So DJ, if you would say hello, and audience, let me know if you can hear DJ by posting a message in the chat panel.
Hey, this is DJ Schleen, live from 6,200 feet in Golden, Colorado.
Great. Our next presenter is Catherine. So Catherine, if you would say hello, and audience, let me know if you can hear Catherine by posting a message in the chat panel.
Hey, everyone.
Great. Our next presenter is Brian. So Brian, if you would say hello, and audience, let me know if you can hear Brian by posting a message in the chat panel.
Hello, this is Brian Dawson. Happy to be here. Have no idea how far above sea level I am, but thanks for having me.
And our final presenter today is Mark. So Mark, if you would say hello, and audience, let me know if you can hear Mark by posting a message in the chat panel.
Hi, I'm Mark Waite.
Great. It looks like all of you are coming through loud and clear, so I'm going to turn things over to you guys to begin the presentation.
Thanks very much, Billy. So is my screen correctly shared? Do you see the title slide, Creating a DevSecOps Playbook? Great. I see heads shaking yes. So thanks very much, everyone. What a treat to be here. Our panel, I am thoroughly impressed with the panel that we've got and the topics we've got. We're going to start right with a current event. So Derek Weeks is going to introduce to us a recent security episode, something that happened, and then we're going to ask our panelists to share with us some of the lessons that they've learned from this very recent security event. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, so this one is super interesting. So earlier this week, the world began to get notification on a new vulnerability that was found by a security researcher in a JavaScript package. The JavaScript package was known as Event Stream, and it was actually in the dependency of that particular JavaScript package called Flat Stream or Flat Map Stream. Flat Map Stream. Say that 10 times fast. So the interesting thing about this is while there have been vulnerabilities in open source components before, this I think was the first instance that we saw publicly of a socially engineered malware injection. So in this particular case, there was a open source project maintainer for this particular event stream project. Someone had come in and started contributing to the open source project and being helpful there. They asked if they could help maintain that particular project, and the authoring credentials were handed over to this particular individual. In some subsequent releases a couple of months ago, that person injected some malware that basically led to capabilities to do some crypto mining capabilities where this particular component was deployed. And we know it was specifically targeting BitPay's Copay wallet, but this particular Java open source component was being downloaded about 2 million times a week. So we were seeing it being downloaded. It was a very popular component being downloaded frequently. It was a socially engineered attack to inject this vulnerable code into this particular project, where it is then downloaded by software developers around the world and embedded into their applications. We saw just yesterday BitPay was announcing to their customers not to use certain versions of their software that included this open source component. So not only was it being downloaded millions of times, it was showing up in production applications. And I think it just points to from a security perspective, understanding if you're using open source components, anyone that wanted to know if they were impacted from this needed to answer two questions. Did we ever use event stream or flat map stream? And if we did, where did we use that to know if they're impacted? If you're not tracking what open source you're using and where, it's very difficult to answer those first two questions to understand, do you need to do any remediation, unless you're going on a scavenger hunt now across your application portfolio to understand where you might have used that particular JavaScript package. So I think I hit on most of the key things within that attack, but it's interesting because the thing that changes here is most traditional attacks, if you will, relied upon a vulnerability being discovered in an open source component and then being announced, and then the attackers would go and try and find the exploits. For example, the Equifax breach was a announced struts vulnerability that then people figured out what the exploit pattern was. In this particular case, the adversary knew the exploit pattern because they created the vulnerability that got deployed everywhere. So they're reducing the mean time to exploit significantly, going from what used to be days or weeks to they can attack it instantly.
Thanks very much, Derek. So DJ, would you be willing to, from your experience at Aetna in the healthcare business where security is a big deal, what lessons learned might you share with us about this particular example? What should we take from this? What might we do differently?
Well, I think the number one thing that we got to do as any organization is know what is coming in and where it is. That I think is going to be the biggest part of this for a lot of large enterprises. If you don't know what kind of software you're using, you don't know like what kind of impact you have on your organization, right? So like this specific vulnerability should trigger off like a security incident, right? Where we start, going down the path of, sending out emails and saying who has this, right? And that's sort of the traditional way of doing this. This is where DevSecOps comes in, where you have that automation and that monitoring, and you can quickly determine where things are. So I think that's one takeaway from this is, making sure that people have a manifest almost of things that come into their environment for every product they have. The second part of this is, where does disclosure, this responsible disclosure, come from? Where Equifax, all of this, basically they know about the vulnerabilities, but they don't announce them for either weeks or, in this case, I think there was like a 6-day lag. So, when does it come into play where we, have organizations protected from this from this vulnerability? And really all this code is just going out to other folks, right? So there's a bit of a catch-22 there where, if you announce it to the public, that's irresponsible disclosure from an ethical hacking perspective. But disclosing it with the responsible mind to the producer of the software, you're really ignoring the impact on your customers at that point, in my opinion, anyway.
Thank you. Well, and this one was particularly complicated. If I understand correctly, the malware payload was actually encrypted, and they had to do decryption and some really serious reverse engineering to understand even what it was doing. So quite a complicated thing. Thanks very much, DJ. Shannon, from your position in the financial business, hey, another place where security is a big deal, what lessons learned would you share with us?
I think it's important for people not only to know where they have this stuff, but also to have the right operating model. When you look at how developers are pulling in packages and the dependency trees and things like that, automation is really helpful, but it's also important that you're seeing more restacks more frequently, because just finding it isn't enough. You have to remediate against it, which means there may have to be code changes that have to be made to the actual application. In this case, this package was pretty well known, and that requires some foresight into making sure you can make changes quickly. Are there other packages available? And having that ability to look for other packages is really important.
So now this to our panelists, this one is one of those where the disclosure came and the remediation is happening sort of after the fact because it wasn't a known quantity. It seems like this makes velocity a critical part of what we're doing here. Any guidance you'd give us on how we deal with these things fast and safe at the same time? So as I think, go ahead, DJ.
Yeah, I think dealing with it fast is, conditioning the, your pipeline, your development teams, your DevOps, DevSecOps teams to, deploy software faster so that when a fix comes out, they can deploy it very seamlessly and very quickly. And that goes for any vulnerability, right? You want to make sure you can get it out to production quickly. And again, it comes back down to knowing what you have, right? Knowing what's going through.
Yeah, I think an interesting kind of perspective on this is in this particular case, there's a vulnerability that's announced, and you need to know, what's there. But if it was a normal case where a new vulnerability was discovered, the exploit is not necessarily known right up front. You have to think about what do I have? Do I have, am I impacted by that vulnerability? And how quickly can I move? And some part of DevSecOps relates to those practices of how quickly can I move. But at the same time, we have to think about how fast are the adversaries moving. So if a new vulnerability is announced today in something, and the exploits are available 12 hours from now on GitHub, and you have this thing in your environment, how fast can you move and your development teams move to say, how do I remediate this? If there is a remediation path, can we actually deploy that faster than the adversaries can come and attack us with that exploit? So it's not just about the outbound speed of your organization, but the inbound speed of the adversaries coming at you with that exploit.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, or an interesting point, because this one was different because rather than having a component with a vulnerability, this was actually mining or taking people's money, right? So that's where
about dissemination. I mean, this wasn't a vulnerability. This was dissemination.
Yeah,
and that's such a different thing. I mean, from my perspective, that makes it so that the supply chain is becoming a weapon, if you will.
I like that. Good phrasing. So the supply chain has changed, as in this case been subverted, and that subverting of the supply chain has done damage now all the way to the customer.
Yeah, and we have to figure out a way to really ensure that we have the right checks and balances throughout that, environment, so that you have software that's being published the right way.
Yeah, and I think if I may add, Mark, kind of going back to the title of this webinar, creating a DevSecOps playbook, I think something I'm running to in the field a lot is people are at a point of maturity where they've kind of nailed down their, I'll call it raw or fundamental DevOps pipeline. Yet they need to reach more completely to the left, engage security as an inherent part of the process. And people are they're coming to us or coming to me asking, how do I make the case to security? First of all, I think to create a DevSecOps playbook at the front end of the playbook has to be bringing people along. It has to be making the case that you are more secure if you can respond faster. So i.e. we're creating this higher velocity, we can react faster, vulnerabilities or exploits are inevitable. We need to be positioned to be able to respond to them quickly. So going back to, I think, DJ's comment, it is important to be able to react quickly, i.e. you need to have a robust, high velocity software delivery pipeline and process. And then in terms of establishing a playbook, it's important to be able to communicate and convince your security stakeholders of that.
Well, the other thing too is like, how do you identify these as they come in? There's a severe lack of technical security folks that could just jump in and look at this, right? That's going to be a problem as well. So It's one thing to pull the component down, but even like investigating it, this one, no automated tool is going to find this, right? Well, there will now, but the way that the attackers implemented this was extremely creative, where they just did it over a period of time. This is APTs, or advanced persistent threats, for software, and that's a concern. And then how do you detect it? I think that's the outstanding question. Like, how do you look at it when you pull this in, and to see what this is trying to do?
Yeah, I think that's the thing that I know Shannon spends a lot of time on this particular topic of the traditional threats from your adversaries and the attack patterns that used to happen are no longer happening as much, or the most sophisticated types of attacks have changed their parameters, right? So when Shannon is talking about this is dissemination of vulnerabilities through the software supply chain, that was not a kind of known type of attack that we were talking about years ago. In fact, I started documenting it a year ago. It was more like, what are the overall patterns? But I think, Shannon, you're looking at a lot of different types of patterns of attack patterns that are happening out there that kind of traditional security practices aren't necessarily aware of or keeping up with, right?
Yeah, I think the industry as a whole, it's a lot of focus on things like endpoint protection. There's a lot of focus on things like scanning for perimeter protection. And when you really think about where the security industry is when it comes to things like DevSecOps and having it be a capability that all developers have access to, that they have all of the things that they need, they can actually secure their pipelines, they can put the right things in place for their applications, and that's being thought through from ideation, we're transferring a lot of responsibility. And I think that the industry itself is, getting to a point now where we're starting to see some of the solutions needed in a more commoditized fashion. Like, you can actually pick up off the shelf a few of these things that are really going to improve your overall success against some of these attacks. But there are definitely more and more of them happening. And, it brings up a good thought process, which is, how are you dealing with things like fewer, better suppliers? When you're bringing, when you want to do creation and you want to be able to solve a customer problem, how are we building a network of component parts that are safe enough for the things that we're trying to do?
Okay. So you mentioned suppliers. Could you expand a little bit on that? I'm an open source developer, and as such, I'm generally considered to be a low-cost supplier, but that's probably not also making me a trusted supplier. Can you give a little bit of description further on your concept of supplier there?
Yeah, the suppliers, to that end, thank you for developing software, because I think that everybody gets benefit when people do open source their software, and that we see contribution and community involvement and collaboration, because it helps us solve bigger problems faster, right? But the element of trust in the supply chain is something that has to be changed. And right now, if you think about it, anybody can develop any component and anybody can actually leverage that component. And, the question is, when something becomes really popular, how did it start getting so popular? How did it get trusted along the way? And, that's an important part, I think, of the overall thought process of how you put software together. We're seeing more complexity today than we ever have in the software development industry. You can use new services, you can use software components. You're seeing this notion of open source components that are fully managed now. And so you have managed providers that are trying to take on the responsibility of securing these capabilities. And in some ways, thank God for things like the cloud, because we're now seeing some of those open source capabilities really be curated. And I think that's really what I think of when I think of trust, is you're starting to see big name suppliers like an Amazon or a Microsoft or a Google that are really taking on the responsibility of some really important component parts like databases, where those elements are actually being thought about, and they're curating and they're getting speed out of the supply chain. They're making changes as needed. I think to Derek's point about what this particular one is, this is a much smaller component part that's not necessarily being curated. It's not provided as a service, so you don't necessarily know what's happening in the background, and that is dangerous. If we're not seeing people that are actually doing maintained parts, I think that's a really important part of the development process, is that developers should be looking at how long ago was something actually, fixed or checked in, or how many pull requests are sitting, and really, go after it.
I think, I think to broaden the topic a little more beyond open source components, that software that you're bringing in from, sometimes unknown sources of unknown origin, but a container is the same thing. What did you download from Docker Hub today into your organization? So maybe you downloaded 1,000 containers across your enterprise. Where did those come from? What's the quality of those? Is there any version control on those things? Do you know where they were deployed after they were downloaded into either your development stack, your operational stack? Containers are just as important as open source, projects and packages that you're bringing into your organization. It's a software supply chain of things that you didn't build yourself, because it's a lot more efficient. And your innovation can run a lot faster by doing this kind of stuff. So as everyone here has said, that's the good part of this. But I think it comes back to, there are no free kittens. And I think that we need to manage ourselves more in that capacity. And things like this, unfortunately, kind of shed light on the questions of what do we know about what we're using and where is it?
And I think real quick, I'd like to chime in terms of expanding the discussion and talking about supply chain. I always like to cite Xcode Ghost, right? An unexpected place to kind of inject and infect the supply chain, where you have people going out and downloading a tainted compiler, and it's somewhat comparative to downloading open source components, having easy access to this wide pool of assets. Any individual developer can go out and get. But all of these things constitute a component or an aspect of building your application. And if any one of them are compromised, your application can be compromised. So I think the breadth or landscape of challenges to the supply chain is wide and complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. To touch on Derek's point really quickly about containerization, I think the problem is people aren't really versed at using and hardening these things from a security perspective. Not just open source software, but third-party vendors that are, providing, commercial applications that are supported, and they give them to you in a container. The first thing that we do is scan them and look for issues. And not just with one tool, we scan it with multiple tools. We're looking for open source. We're looking for vulnerabilities in the underlying base images. We're actually, if we can, we're looking at Docker files and seeing what's in there. And the horrible reality about it is usually there's more vulnerabilities in these containers and these applications than I've ever seen before. You pull these things into your environment, it's like bringing a Trojan horse in. You're one Nginx ingress configuration issue away from opening it up to the internet. And how we're resolving that is we're actually taking a stance that's almost more strict than what we do internally. We have pretty strict protocols, but especially around containerization and known vulnerabilities. But when you start looking at vendors, we're holding them to the fire, and it's been challenging just because of the fixes and some of the things that aren't fixable from an open source perspective because the project's been abandoned. A lot of issues come out of like that, but it's better to inspect things and know what's in there, and know what your vendors are giving you as well. It's the first time we could really do that, right? Like without reverse engineering an executable. So it's a pretty important thing to do.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So I'd like to shift us a little bit to sort of a little bit different topic. Let's go on one more slide here. And so we talk about security required from everyone, but it typically is driven by the security organization. It classically was, maybe typically is the wrong way to say it. Now, Shannon, I had seen things in your description of the transformation that you've done at Intuit about your implementation of DevSecOps and how you've what I would call a cultural transformation. Would you be willing to share with us some of the things that you observed as you implemented Red Team, as what your experience was there?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, with the speed of DevOps and cloud and agility, it became pretty apparent that there weren't enough security professionals to go around. And I hear quite often these things about we need to make sure we have the requirements. Please give us all the requirements, be a concise list of requirements. And it's like, I don't know how to turn 30 years of what I've been doing this long, this complex, into a very small, concrete list. And I remember that conversation because it really led to, I think, what was next, which is how do you get to sort of this playbook, if you will, and how we started it was we needed to make it so that everybody felt responsible. And I think making everybody feel responsible is about ensuring they have awareness, and they have awareness into some of the depth of the problem space, and that they're interested and curious about it. And so what we did with Red Team was really to make that pop. We said, all right, let's expose it. Let's not only test, but let's actually provide information to all of our organization. Let's go after making sure the top of this organization has a direct responsibility for security. You know, ensuring that people have, they don't just think about it from the standpoint of, oh, that's something I have to check the box on, but they actually internalize that it's really important to the organization as a whole. And I think the top of the organization got an appreciation for Red Team pretty quickly because we ran some exercises where they were involved pretty deeply. And I think that helped to really open everybody's eyes to the problem, that it was actually pretty complicated. And it led to an overall change across the organization. Security is job one, and we are, you know, really mindful about that as an organization. And I think that was a huge part of our transformation. And now you get into the how, right? But if you have everybody's minds and you have their hearts towards doing the right thing, all of the hows, the bits and the things that you're going to have to do every day become a lot easier to understand, because you've really got that direct knowledge that there are adversaries out there, that they are interested in your applications, that they are interested in getting gain, you know, out of the environment. And I think that has led to stronger development practices, that developers are really coming with, you know, some of these security problems that they have and asking for the right things. And that's leading to demand for services and capabilities. And in some cases, those services and capabilities don't exist and you have to build them. I think that, you know, polarity shift is really important when you're talking about setting things up.
So you were able to persuade, it almost sounds like C-level, top-level executive sponsorship or belief in and adoption of the notion that security is crucial and that they wanted to spread it throughout the entire organization.
Yes.
That's great. So go ahead, Derek.
And didn't you also gamify that adoption of mindset a little by scoring the organizations to give them more visibility to are we doing well or are we doing not?
Yeah, we have a dashboard. The dashboard's reviewed every couple of weeks, you know, in a group of people where we basically go through and ensure that we really measure security as a health metric. And I think that dedication is really important. I also think it's really important to ensure that people are starting out with it being fun, right? So we had Red Team Mondays. We now do continuous red teaming. And we have multiple teams that are constantly going after our applications, looking for mistakes, checking. And I think that's also an important part of the culture, is that there's always somebody who's actually going to find these things. So it becomes, you know, important to try and build security into your software sooner. And I also think that unless you give folks an answer, so the one thing I will tell you, if you're going to do this and you're going to put a red team in place and you're going to enforce, you've got to find a way to actually simplify security so that the masses can really adopt it and understand it. And I think that too many of the security, frameworks that are out there right now, they're too complicated. They don't lead to the 80% good with only a few things, which is why we started doing the security hierarchy of needs and really simplifying it so that the masses could be good at it.
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations don't even look at the technology. They're worried about compliance and risk governance and third-party risk assessment, GRC, and that kind of thing. And even like down into the trenches where you have product managers, product owners, business analysts, all that kind of thing. I think if an organization comes out and says, "Hey, we're going to adopt DevSecOps, or we're going to move towards that series or the set of practices," a lot of folks don't even know where to start or what their responsibilities are. So, as part of that playbook is going through your organizational structure and saying, as your role, you're responsible for this, and this is how you communicate to the other roles to ensure that information is disseminated properly. And you said, Shannon, about the dashboard. That's instrumentation and measurement, and that's one of the first things you need to do when you're adopting a DevSecOps and practices and automating your pipelines and putting security controls in there. We got to monitor them and make sure that the information is going to the right people at the right time and is relevant to what they need to do from their decision and what their role is.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to consider too is we're measuring compliance, and sometimes it's being called security.
Yeah.
And I think that's dangerous, because the responsibility that we're talking about is security. We're telling people they need to be more secure. This is not about ensuring that every last control and every framework out there is perfect. It's actually about ensuring that you're working on something that's making it so it gets ahead of adversaries, and that as an organization you understand your adversarial profile so that you can be better at it.
Yep, this is where threat modeling comes into play, right? Nobody would have assumed that this NPM or this JavaScript vulnerability would be an attack vector, so everyone's updating their threat models, hopefully, right now. But yeah, absolutely.
I want to go back to something that Shannon said that was part of something I got really excited about a couple of weeks ago. So Shannon, had just said we have to do something with regard to security and DevSecOps to enable the masses to be good at security, right? So a couple of weeks ago in DC, I was giving a presentation at a meetup. And during my presentation, one of the developers in the audience said, "I just got a notification from GitHub that I have a vulnerability in the code in my repository," right? So in the tool that the developer is using, his tool is telling him there is a security vulnerability here, right? And it's one of those things that I was so excited because it was so simple. Like, I'm the developer, it's my tool, I'm getting information. He was sitting in this meeting, he got an email alert, right? It was usable for him, and not that it was the most sophisticated kind of solution, but just the fact that as a developer, he's getting security information in his tool in a form that he can digest it. It was like, hallelujah. I didn't even ask him, like, is that a GitHub solution or a third-party plugin or whatever? It was just finally like, this is closer to DevSecOps, when it's not a security person in the audience saying, "I see all these red flags with what our developers are doing." It's the developer saying, "I saw this, I'm now informed, I now need to take action," right? But that was kind of making security easier for the masses, of kind of the guidance of what we're moving toward. Have does your playbook make security easier for that person that is developing the code, that is developing the applications that your business is relying on, and that your adversaries are trying to penetrate to get to the data that resides in those that they see as valuable?
I love what you're saying, because GitHub and GitLab have both added that vulnerability checking and scanning upon commit. And it's amazing to see that transformation. It's amazing to see companies, large and small, starting to try and add security features so that everybody who needs them, when they need them, it's available. And I think I'm hoping that over this next couple of years, we're going to see more commoditized players start to do that, add more security features. We're seeing, companies start to get snapped up in the security industry from players that you wouldn't have expected prior. And I think that revolution, that change is really what we've needed to be able to highlight getting security to the forefront and ensuring that we're going to have safe compute.
Well, this is ultimately moving all this stuff left in a transparent way, right? So when you're doing it on a commit level, if it doesn't interrupt the speed of the commit and having that information come back, that's moving it completely left, and it's transparent, right? There's some tools that developers are using anyway that you can add security plugins into, and at that point, the friction behind implementing a new tool is a lot. I think it's reduced a lot, right?
I think it's a great start. I don't know if it's the end or ideal state, but it's a great start. I think from an overall playbook perspective, it's one of the first things I would say has to happen, but it's still a lagging indicator. And so the problem with vulnerabilities showing up even early in the commit process, you're still waiting for somebody to find that vulnerability before it becomes apparent to you. Fortunately, it does increase speed. So it is a better mechanism for notifying a developer that they have a problem when a vulnerability does come out, because they can go do a commit and all of a sudden it's like a vulnerability that may have come out hours ago could show up. And that's great, but I still feel like it's a lagging issue.
Well, it's a safety net, right? As we start moving these plugins and add-ins into the IDEs, depending on what IDE you're using, you're getting that feedback right away as you start typing, something that's giving you vulnerability. So, at the time when you check it in, that's like the safety net.
Yeah.
It also goes back to something Shannon, said earlier about if you're talking about leading and lagging indicators, look at your security budget. Is it focused on lagging indicators, for security, or is it focused on leading indicators? And how much, what's the investment profile that you're looking at, as you approach your playbook, and how much information are you giving to security people versus, developers if it pertains to application security? Where are you being attacked? What are the attack patterns? And are you investing in those things, or are you just investing in, Gartner said these are the top 5 security tools that CISOs are investing in, so that's how you created your budget. I think that the investment profiles also need to be looked at as part of the playbook of, are you investing in the right kind of places to make the best impact?
Well, it's like throwing the book at security. Like Shannon, I think when we were talking at RSA this year, you were talking about like knowing your adversary, right? Knowing what security controls you want to have in place. You might, for example, if you're running if you're not running Docker containers and you're running container vulnerability analysis software, like that's an extreme case, but it's going to be sort of irrelevant, right? But Shannon, you took that almost completely right, and with the adversary return rate and all that kind of thing, and looking at what they're trying to do.
Critical to have adversary return rate as a metric, because if you're not actually measuring that, you're not necessarily checking yourself against how good they are. And if you're basically building security to be perfect across the board, that's hard.
So Shannon, there are a couple of terms here that I don't recognize. Adversary return rate. Forgive my inexperience. Could you explain that? And if you'd be willing, also, the leading versus lagging indicators, I'd like an explanation of the phrase red team. What is a red team? Help our audience understand, people like me who aren't deep into DevSecOps like you are. Could you share with us those two?
Yeah, absolutely. So a red team is a team of folks that are basically set up to find vulnerabilities, weaknesses, leverage them, exploit them, make them, pop up, and ensure that developers get a sense of when a vulnerability is there, whether it's actually important or not to an adversary from their perspective. And you set up basically adversarial campaigns across the board to make it so that you can find something from an external perspective or an internal perspective. There's a lot of red teams out there that work on crown jewel work, and that's important as well. When you unpack that a little bit further, it provides a competitor to an actual adversary. So if you think about a vulnerability laying out there, if there's no adversaries for it, then basically you might have time to be able to fix that vulnerability, right? If there's no interest for it and there's no adversary interest, there's pretty much going to be no compromise. So what you're looking for is understanding what adversaries does your application have? How often do they return? And if those adversaries are really interested, they're probably returning more frequently and for longer periods of time. And understanding how they're operating can be really helpful to understand, what speed do you have to operate at? How do you pull together your teams, hopefully small DevOps teams, to be able to make changes, to make your software resilient enough, and really pull together all of the information necessary to do that in a prioritized way. Like, I think the worst thing that can happen is that you've got 300 vulnerabilities as a developer and you don't know where to start. And critical and high doesn't necessarily cut it. But if you start to paint them with adversary interest, it becomes really apparent very quickly. Like, you have, a top 10 all of a sudden show up, and you've got maybe like 5 criticals and 2 highs, and those become really apparent because the adversary is sending in payloads and they're doing things against your infrastructure, and that really does become something you want to build against.
So now, Derek, in earlier questions, had noted the sensitive or the importance of having more and less detailed, depending, more or less detailed information on particular vulnerabilities, on particular things. How do you gather the return rate metric that you were describing? Are there other things that about relevance, about more detail about vulnerabilities that we need to be tracking? Sorry, Derek, did we just lose your voice?
Sorry. Yeah, I was asking if that question was for me or a comment about what I said.
I was trying, I think, more to ask it at Shannon in terms of, are there things that we need more detail about in order to decide adversary return rate? How do you do that kind of thing?
So you have to have things like RASP. You want to put that on the front end of your application. You might want to gather logs and telemetry information to give you a sense of what the hopefully the 1% are doing, because basically abuse cases are edge cases. And most developers really work towards use case, right? They work towards what's the most important use cases so that I can hit the maximum number of people with my application. And so bad guys and abuse cases, they sit in the other part of that. They sit in the edge case. They're not the stuff that developers want to solve for. And so, how your application might be leveraged is going to be an abuse case. And so it's kind of a counteract to that use case. I think that's an important part of pulling together your telemetry, is to understand when you're actually logging something, behavioral characteristics are really in the abuse case, and having that anti-pattern information is essential to being able to spot it, and providing that to security folks who spend most of their time chasing down understanding for adversaries, and getting that back is of value to your development groups.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Could I ask a slightly different question now? And I think I want this to go to both Shannon and to DJ, in terms of how do you persuade senior executives that the security efforts that you're adding aren't going to slow down their development process, that it's not going to cripple them? Tell me about the persuasion you've used, or the data you've brought, the techniques you've used to show people that it needs to be integral, and why.
Shannon, I'll let you go first with that one.
If you do it right, so I'll say this. Developers, once you change the polarity, they're actually arguing for it themselves. And now you're just backup. From a security perspective, you're there to basically ensure that they get the investment they need to make the application secure enough. It's no longer about ensuring that the security team is getting the backing it needs. It's actually completely an opposite equation. And I think that's become really powerful as a mechanism, because now when a developer is concerned about something, they can raise their hand, get in front of the right people, ensure we have the right investments, and they're going to the most critical parts of the application.
So that change of polarity, Was that a matter of your red team persuading them by showing them, hey, we're broken here, and they suddenly caught fire? They got really enthusiastic? How did you make that cultural shift?
Yeah, I think when developers started getting the defects in their backlog, and I think this goes to what Derek was saying earlier, when somebody commits code and they see the vulnerabilities right away, it is their responsibility, it is their work. And I think, Josh Corman also said something that was really interesting. When I first got, wind of it, I was really kind of amiss. And it was basically that developers think of security as unplanned, unscheduled work. And it bugged me so badly. And then I realized, like, it is a spreadsheet or a CSV file or whatever. And they're like, what do I do with this? And if you just enter the defects directly into their backlog, it's their work. They have to deal with it. And they can decide not to deal with it, but it's going to continue to mount, right?
Yeah, I think, going back to the GitHub situation that I mentioned, the guy in the audience last week, right? So when you think about, did the information that he was getting slow him down, right? In this case, as a developer, he's getting information in the tool that he uses that provides him information to say, hey, I have to take action and I'm responsible for my code. In an alternative scenario, if he didn't have that, imagine we took that capability away from GitHub that he was using for those notifications, and we took it away from the developer and gave it to the security team. And after he's finished designing his code, he's submitted it, it's integrated into the app, it's gone off to be staged for production release, and security then analyzes it. As he's now on to the new sprint, in a new project that he's working on, security comes back and says, hey, there's a vulnerability. Again, I'm introducing Rework as a security person saying, I found a vulnerability in your code. He's now like, okay, now I need to find time to go and correct this later. That is actually like that kind of more old school process of bolt-on security at the end of the process is actually slowing you down more in that particular case than just giving the developer the information up front. So in the case of like, is security going to slow me down? If you do it right, depending on the kind of tooling that you're using, you can actually speed it up where that developer doesn't have rework, or the rework loop is so short because I just found the vulnerability, I can hopefully remediate it quickly and then move on. And then security isn't coming back 2 weeks from now or a month from now saying, hey, we found that vulnerability in your code.
The CBTs come in play, or instructor-based training, that kind of thing. Because when you look at that situation where you have a vulnerability coming into a developer, like let's say it's SQL injection or some sort of injection flaw, right? And they look at it and they're like, I don't understand what this means. So they're going to come back to the security organization and they're going to say, can you describe this? And I bet you the amount of folks in your organization or anybody's security organization who can describe what SQL injection or an injection flaw is and actually show a developer are few and far between. So that becomes a issue where, not even an issue, but a situation where you want to embed a security resource into that development team or that feature team if you can, or even across a bunch of feature teams where you would operate on a horizontal level across those teams where you're sitting in the trenches with everybody saying, okay, I'm reviewing your code, this is this, or helping them triage potential false positives in some of these tools that come out. And that's the only way you're going to have security left, is if you have security left to actually explain and train folks. Eventually, I hope that we get to the point where DevSecOps is just DevOps because we think about security all the time. But until we get to that point, we're going to be constantly dealing with drag. And to answer Mark's question really quickly about selling things to executives or selling DevSecOps up the organizational structure, there's a couple of ways to do it, right? They see a couple of things. They see their developers operating in an efficient way and getting product out faster. And a lot of times they're like, well, how does that happen? And why doesn't everybody do that? So the other point of it is budget, like, trying to find out what your average, your mean time to, repair, all that kind of thing, and seeing like how many man hours go into remediating a vulnerability or people hours, and what's the cost associated with that. And then based on our threat modeling and what we know our adversaries are going to do, what's the risk to the organization? And then calculate the risk and apply that number amount, like how much that's going to potentially affect your organization, downtime, that kind of thing, legal fees, whatever it could be, and add that together with the amount of money that you're spending on development right now versus how you would spend it when you have a DevSecOps program or practices in place, and then take those numbers to your executives and say, hey, we're saving this amount of money when we do things in a DevSecOps manner versus how we're doing things now. And that is a pretty powerful argument when you say, hey, we're going to save money because you're increasing shareholder value, all that kind of thing, right? So there's different, up the organizational structure, there's different, not requirements, but, needs and wants, from either financial perspective or development or security. Everybody has their fingers in this pie. And that's one of the important things to know about DevOps culture is everybody is a part of that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So another follow-on question, could you, Shannon and then DJ, share with us some obstacles you've encountered as you've gone through these transformations, as you've been working on your DevSecOps journey, obstacles you've encountered and ways that you thought that were creative and interesting resolutions to those obstacles. And it could be cultural, it could be technical. I'm open to any of your insights on the kinds of barriers you've encountered.
I think I've probably encountered so many. Where do I start?
We're coming out on that topic.
Yeah, there might be. Yeah, we're definitely working on a DevSecOps book, and I think that having obstacles is just part of the process. This is new ground. Frankly, everybody who's trying to implement DevSecOps or put security further up into the development process to enable and empower developers and makers. I like to, instead of say developers, they're makers in my mind, people who are creative and who are putting things together. And so when you want to empower a maker to be able to do security well, I think of it as one of the biggest impediments and obstacles I think started with the security team itself is, as a service provider, I'm really curious and interested in what people need. It's unfortunate, though, that makers still don't know how to ask for things that they need. They're not fully knowledgeable yet. And so I still feel like that's the opportunity ahead is, what are the adversary types, helping people to understand what they're encountering, giving them just enough knowledge to really be powerful consumers of security technology and capabilities, such that they can really drive their own list. Like I said earlier, give me a requirements list. I think it's actually quite opposite. I'd really like to have a maker tell me what they need so that we can find a way to provide it faster, easier. I've seen some amazing change throughout the industry. Some of it started with, I have a call to action, which is every application out there should have MFA on it. And that was one of the early things that I think we also picked on with our organization was MFA was essential and critical. And I remember a few large organizations out there that contacted me about that call to action and said, we'll watch how you go along with it because we're worried about consumer friction. And if you do MFA right, there shouldn't be consumer friction. From my perspective, we've really just got to figure out all of the things that stop us. They shouldn't stop us. It shouldn't be a blocker. It should be something that we look at, deal with, and sometimes those things are hard. So, some of it in my mind was biggest obstacles would be I had to change me. I had to change, how I thought about the problem. I had to stop thinking that I was going to have to work in the way that I was being told to work for many, many years. I mean, it's unfortunate that we've created very siloed groups within most companies, and the biggest impediment I think to most organizations is changing and transforming and leading people to understand what their next role is and how to be successful at it. And I can't say that I got there the easiest way. There was a lot of head bumping and banging around, but ultimately, there's a lot of people now in my organization that understand that security has to be a capability, part of a city map that the developers can actually pull from. So, but I could go on and on about obstacles, to be honest.
Thank you. Thanks very much. DJ, could you share with us your observations on obstacles you've encountered? I love that you and Shannon come from both security critical environments. So please share with us obstacles you've encountered and ways you overcame them. Uh-oh, DJ, did we lose you?
See, DJ looks paused on my.
He does. He looks awfully static.
Frozen and.
He looks good though.
It's a good look. It's a nice look. That's right.
So hopefully DJ will come back on, so I'll take a shot at kind of one of the obstacles. I think Shannon certainly hit on some of this. That the one quote that just stands out to me, and I heard it a couple of years ago from Mika Dienen, who works at the Dutch tax office, as they were on their DevOps journey. She said, "My biggest obstacle was people said I like my silo. I've lived here for years. I work well in this. I was trained in this silo," right? And Shannon's like, I have to kind of retrain myself. Fits in that kind of like, I grew up in this silo. This is how I made my career. So that kind of that kind of mindset is part of the obstacle. I think the other part of the mindset, and this is something I heard from CSO in San Francisco, working at a large software company, said, I have a 5-minute rule. And as head of security, when I know my internal stakeholder is the development team that I'm working with, that if I can't produce answers in under 5 minutes for them to be able to have information and take action upon, then I can't take whatever security solution I'm thinking about buying for the organization and bring it to that group. Because I'm used to things where producing results in 4 hours or 8 hours might have been good for me in the past and for my security team. But if I'm going to make it useful for developers, more than 5 minutes and I've lost them, right? They're looking at this thing is slow. I have work to get done. It's not fast enough. And so he was bringing a mindset of what does my customer want and how do I have to deliver it to them? So if a security vendor came in and was pitching something and they couldn't produce a result in 5 minutes that was useful, he said, look, I can't even start the conversation with you because you don't fit into something that's going to fit with my internal customer, right? And that's part of just the mindset changes on how do we need to rethink about the work that we're doing or the business value that we're trying to deliver, even to our own internal stakeholders.
Thank you. I loved Shannon's phrasing of the word maker, and I like being thought of as a maker. And makers want to make. And if I have to wait 8 hours, I can't be making in that 8 hours. That sort of breaks me down. Thank you very much. DJ, glad to have you back. We have just about ran out of time. Billy, I think it may be at this point where we need to turn it over to you to let you thank you very much to our panelists, Shannon, Derek, DJ, and Brian. You have been absolutely wonderful. What a privilege to talk with you. Thanks very much for the conversation about DevSecOps and getting a playbook together. Billy, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for everyone. It was a wonderful presentation today. I'd also like to thank today's sponsor, CloudBees, for providing the audience with a wonderful webinar presentation. And lastly, thank you to everyone who attended this webinar. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Have a great day, and we will see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks again.